So we all know that everywhere in the world, schools have been closed, some for weeks, others for months. Uh, we saw a graph with a huge variation in how many school days were lost in countries all over the world earlier in the conference. And we know that these school closures have led to learning losses, like less learning than would otherwise have been achieved. So what can schools do to remediate those losses? That's basically the question that I will tackle today. And the presentation has the following parts. First, we'll discuss how to decide on a program. So kind of like a process model of how you would, as a school, choose. Then we go through the phase of diagnosing what is needed in your school. And then on how to choose a program given your diagnosis. So first, deciding on a program, how would you do that? Well, there's a whole literature on choosing and interventions. And in one of the earlier sessions, Hanke Kurpershoek also presented her model of how you should do that on the basis of evidence. But for this special situation, I'll use the following process model. This is taken from the Dutch government's guidelines, and I've not taken the trouble to see whether other countries have maybe come up with other guidelines, because it seems a pretty rational model. You should first diagnose where the losses are. So what are you actually trying to remediate? Then you should choose the goals of the program on the basis of your diagnosis. So what are you going to what is the loss that you're going to focus on, or losses, if you want multiple focuses. Evaluating program options, so seeing what options for a remediation program would be best, also in light of your resources as a school. Discussing those options, choosing one, and implementing it. That's the kind of model that I'll use. And every one of those steps can be taken at the school level and at the national level. A different session today, like the keynote at the end, will discuss what actually is best. Should you do all this at school level, or should you do this in one go as a national program? Well, in the Netherlands, the choice has been to make all decisions at the level of the school or school board. So, but at a local level. So all schools can choose a different program, different goals, have a different diagnosis. If that's what schools have to do, take all those steps for their school. How do you go about that? Well, I'd argue that, for example, if you go to first step, diagnosis, that the universe of things you could look at is infinite. So therefore, it would help if others, for example, educational scientists, came up with plausible hypotheses for what loss is. And so I'll discuss some plausible hypotheses, and then discuss aids and tools that you could use to make a diagnosis within your school. But let's first hear your opinion as an audience. And for that, we have the invaluable tool Mentimeter. So I hope you can switch to, or use your phone or whatever to go to menti.com. Maybe have a separate screen on your laptop and type in this code. I'll quickly start up the, where's my browser? There it is. And then, All right. Let me. Ah, dang. Sorry. Yeah. I hope it's open, and otherwise, no, I have to present. And I'll put on the. So if you now go to menti.com, the number is on top again. So 82561145. And please grade these hypotheses. Are they plausible or are they implausible? The last one is that there's actually not that much of a loss during the pandemic. I don't see answers yet. Ah, there they are. Yeah. Yeah. Still changing. So we have a clear winner at the moment. Okay, I'll go over not that many voters, but the ones that did vote were pretty united in that they think that losses depend on student background. And then we go back to the presentation. And so happens that I agree that loss is greatest at the bottom of the distribution, but what distribution? There's another one that I think is pretty plausible. That is that subjects that received least attention during the lockdown are the ones that show the greatest loss. So it's basically a time on task hypothesis. If you didn't spend time on it, then the loss is going to be greater. One that I think is plausible is loss is greater for younger than older students. I didn't see you agreeing, but I hope to present some evidence that this is indeed plausible. But let's start with the one greatest at the bottom and subjects not taught. The first quantitative study into learning losses was of Engzel, Vrij, and Verhagen. They reside at Oxford, so it says Oxford study, but it's actually of a study of Dutch students. On the x-axis is learning loss in percentiles. So how much lower is your percentile if you plot performance of individual students against historic distribution, so not the distribution of the particular year, it's a historic distribution, and how much lower are students on average in the year of the first lockdown. So this is the tests taken in June 2020. How much lower are scores relative to historic averages? And what you see is that some variables, that there's losses for everyone, and that some variables don't matter that much. So if you look at boys versus girls, doesn't matter. Grades, grade 4 up to grade 7, doesn't really matter. But also prior performance doesn't really matter. So if you bin students according to how well they scored on the last test before the lockdown, and then on how much loss they have on the subsequent test, you actually don't see much. So the students who had low scores prior to the pandemic don't preferentially show losses. What you do see is a preferential loss for reading comprehension. And if you then look at what schools did, they during the lockdown, you see that they spend a lot of time on math and on spelling. So the fields that have less of a learning loss. And reading comprehension was one of the fields that many schools did not pay much attention to. So that's the subject not taught. And then there is the finding that got most attention, namely that students whose parents have lower educational attainment had larger learning losses. So reading comprehension, parental education, those seem to be variables that matter. Then again, this is, we in the Netherlands have a highly tracked secondary school system. And here you see weeks of learning loss for secondary school students on basic skills. And so the higher the column, the worse. It means more loss. And you see the tracks ordered from highest to lowest. And what you see is that the loss is a monotonic function of track. So the lower tracks have higher losses in reading, spelling, math, and English than the students in the higher tracks. So why do I think that it's greater for younger students? Well, actually, if you that's not based on studies within primary education, secondary education, or higher education. It's based on a comparison of higher versus secondary versus primary education. If you look at studies of higher education, you actually see no loss. So students in higher education hated online education, the fact that that campuses were closed and that they had to work at home. They said that they spent less time on education, but still their performance is actually better during the pandemic than it was in previous years. So it seems that, by the way, it seems that students, older students in the tertiary education are able to cope with the fact that they have to learn at home. Why would that be? Well, better skills for self-regulated learning. So my hypothesis is the more self-regulated learning, the better, the less losses. Apologies for the helicopter if you hear it. We're close to a hospital. Just as an aside, why are students demotivated? The funny thing is that they list the freedom that comes from being at home as both a motivating factor, but also a demotivating factor, and mostly a demotivating factor. So all the red ones are factors that students list as demotivating, the green as motivating. You see freedom in both. Lack of social interaction, that's actually the big factor that leads to demotivation. The fact that you can plan your own time and get out of bed when you want to and don't have to factor in the time to get to the campus, that's the big plus. And so, digital discomfort is things that you don't like about having to Zoom or use online platforms. So those are what I think are plausible hypotheses. If you then go to the school level, how would you do diagnosis? The first question you have to ask, is it actually possible? Are there sufficient measurements in a school? And is a school big enough to have any statistical power? And then what about causality? So the only thing you can actually observe is that scores are low. Is that because of a pandemic, or is that because of some other reason? maybe students were already demotivated before the pandemic struck, or would have had lower scores anyway because whatever factor. But my simple answer to that is, well, it doesn't really matter. If you observe lower scores, go do something about it, whether it has to do with the pandemic or not. And the question is, can you get help as a school? We, as a research institute, try to help, and I suppose many other researchers all over the world are trying to help schools in diagnosing what's going on. We developed a battery for social emotional functioning with academic self-concept, school motivation, school well-being, social acceptance. The problem is you never have null base measurements. So what do you compare it with? Well, what we've tried to do is come up with a system where schools are compared to other schools. So you cannot show that a school has a problem with motivation, specifically because of the pandemic, but you can say, compared to other schools that are in the same situation, namely a pandemic, your school your students have better motivation and worse social well-being. Oh, sorry, I see that's the graph is the Dutch one, not the English one. But it's in the same ordering. So the first in are is motivation, self concept, well-being, and acceptance. And so we developed a script that would color bars if the school is outside of the range of other schools on a particular thing. Green if it's actually good, red if your school has worse findings than others. And we hope that this helps schools determine what to focus on. By the way, if you look at those, you can also look at what do age and track do. And age is linked to higher age, lower motivation, higher age, lower well-being, pretty sad. And track, that's even more sad finding. The lower the track, the lower academic self-concept. Well, it replicates other frameworks. So, given those aids and tools, how would you go about choosing a program? As academics trying to help schools, can we tell schools what works? And do we know where and for whom that works? Okay, back to the Mentimeter. I am curious what you think. And then we go on to, no, sorry, share. Yes. On to the next question. Who should choose the program? Should schools do that? Should schools do that from a menu developed by a higher authority? Should a higher authority do it for the schools? So for example, national government, or is there no program needed? Or do you have some other opinion? I'm curious what you think. Other. Of course, this makes it really mysterious what other option you are referring to. Well, luckily a new group has joined. I give it 30 seconds more. Curious who will cast the deciding vote on these two options. Okay, well, then if you were one of the people that said other, please write in the chat what you were thinking of. Schools choosing from a menu by a higher authority, that's actually what has happened in the Netherlands. So the government made a menu of options for schools to choose from. And the menu was so broad that schools can do almost anything they want and put it in one of the options of the government menu. Okay. Oh, I see a question. How do you actually measure learning loss? To do that, you need a standardized test that you, where you know what normal scores are, and then compare the scores during the pandemic or after with what they would normally be. That's the short answer of how you measure learning loss. At the level of a school, that's much more difficult because you usually don't have prior scores that you can compare with. Or in any case, they are so noisy that you wouldn't be able to pinpoint to learning loss. That's what I mentioned earlier. So, first of all, should we just not let time do the work? Is there actually a need for programs? And here there is a model of Kaffenberger and Pritchett based on previous school closures. For example, because of an earthquake in Pakistan, schools were closed for quite a while. And Kaffenberger and Pritchett looked at what, how much of the time that students spent at home bled into permanent learning loss. And their odd finding was that a 3-month school closing because of an earthquake had metastasized into more than a year of learning loss after 2 years. Well, how's that possible? They have this very simple model that they also use to fit PISA scores with. And on the x-axis, it has achievement at the start of the year, and at the y-axis, gains during the year. So how much have you learned at the start of the year? That's on the x-axis. How much are you learning during the year? The y-axis. And what they find is a function like this. So the more you've learned prior, the more you're learning. The better students learn more during the year than the worst students. It's called the Matthew effect, and it's found in many countries. But the more shocking thing is what happens at the sides of this. They find that if you know too much, you're not learning very much anymore. And that's pretty simple. If at the start of the year you already know what's going to be taught in that year, you're not going to learn anything. But also, if you know too little, you're not going to learn anything. And that is if you as a student are not able to follow what's happening in the classroom, you're not picking up anything. And that was happening in Pakistan. Their teachers just gave the regular classes that they would do, and their students with 3 months of no schooling had no way to latch on and were actually not learning anything. Well, that's the danger that we now face, that some students are so far behind that they stop being able to follow what's happening in class. There's a famous finding that 1 year of suboptimal learning in a school has a lifelong effect. So this is a real risk. Well, given that you are going to do a program, what you should do? Luckily, there's many what works summaries, and we've heard the keynote speaker at the start explain how these are created and how thoroughly they were put together. Translating that into practice can be a challenge. That's was also mentioned at the keynote. In the Netherlands, there's a group that is busy writing what they called practice cards. Those are basically translations of the programs that work in studies into how you can implement them in your school. So, and what you can also do is look at what previous schools did previously. For example, this is programs that were chosen by Dutch secondary schools during the fall of 2022. And you see that the vast majority, 70%, goes for tutoring in one form or another. Other schools go to homework, exam training. That sums to more than 100% because schools could do more than one thing. So I'll skip this. This is computer-aided practice can help overcome learning loss. Actually, students did better during the pandemic than they would have done in a normal year in schools that had adaptive practice for mathematics. I'll skip this. So what would I advise? Well, tutoring of children is a fine investment. Professionalizing one's staff is more durable, so an even better one. And so is investing in digital support for teachers, mostly the kind that saves teachers time, because they will spend that time aiding students. And investing in saving teachers time is always a good idea. So, do we know for whom programs work? Well, no, we don't, but we have tools to help schools investigate that, and that's with theory of change. Our group has made it a tool to help schools develop a theory of change. And then my time is up and I'm done. So what have we learned? I've discussed plausible hypotheses. Losses are greatest at the bottom with students, with parents with lower educational attainment. For ignored subjects in younger children, there are tools from scientists that can help schools in diagnosis. Time does not necessarily heal. What works reviews and translation into practice are available. And does it work in your school? Well, find out with your own theory of change.